How we got it, that's a long story. But yes, it really is a coffin, and yes, it really was used, just once. Now, it's full of vampire books, horror novels, and ghost stories. Some people think it's cool, others think it's creepy, but we like it, and the guy who used to be in there hasn't complained. Sellers and Newell Secondhand Books, 672 College and at sellersandnewell.com. Great books and a used coffin.
Let's make your next donation to CIUT on me. Clayton Book here, broker with PSR Brokerage, and when you buy, sell, or lease your next property with me, I'll donate 5% to CIUT on your behalf. Find out more at movewithclay.com.
From the roots up, CIUT 89.5 FM, Toronto.
Here again, baby, I'm stretched out on my bed, seeing all kinds of crazy notions running through my head. I need a progressive woman, I need an awfully liberal woman. Ain't no reactionary, baby, can't ease my revolutionary mind. One hand is on my pillow, one hand is on my head.
Welcome back. My name is Riley Mormon, and you're listening to Student Revolutions in History on CIUT 89.5 FM. That's right, folks, it's that time of the week again. We're back to talk revolution, and specifically this week, we'll be continuing our cliffhanger of an episode last week on Henry Kissinger, and this week we'll be focusing more on the Vietnam War protests, and eventually the student movements that brought down Henry Kissinger and the Nixon government. We'll be talking about all of that and so much more. But if you weren't here for last week's episode, or you want to hear any other episode, each and every episode is recorded and downloaded and available as a podcast on the CIUT.FM website. So don't worry if you can't make it one week, because you can always stay up to date on revolutions in history and current political thought. We'll be leading into a little bit of a series after this on current American politics and the implications for the next couple of years. But before we get into any of that, we'll be talking about Vietnam, about the counterculture movements, and about really the heart of student revolutions in the last 100 years. So stay tuned for that, just after we finish this tune.
Revolutionary mind. If I could only make you see, babe, how I ache and pain and bleed, I know you'd come a-running if you blistered both your feet. I need a nature-loving woman, I need a social conscious woman, and no reactionary, baby, can't ease my revolutionary mind. See me here, baby, broke out in salty sweat. No matter where you go, I know you never could forget. I need a progressive shipmate, I need a liberous nature lover, I need an open-minded mama to ease my revolutionary mind. I ain't no lumping proletariat, I ain't no petty bourgeoisie, but I'm gonna be a cold corpse if you don't run here to me. I need a weather underground woman, I need a Zapatista woman, ain't no Fox News watching female can ease my revolutionary mind. Republican or a Democrat or a White Hood Ku Klux Klan. No use to ring my doorbell, 'cause I'll never be your man. I need a union working woman. I need an Occupy Wall Street woman. I need a Woody Guthrie loving woman to ease my revolutionary, ease my revolutionary, ease my revolutionary mind.
That was Tom Morello with Ease My Revolutionary Mind. An all-time classic and just an amazing song. And that's right, this week we'll be talking about a Weather Underground woman, a revolutionary woman, a counterculture woman, and an environmentalist woman, because all of these, and so much more, are caught up in the New Left movement that really started getting going in the early 60s and massively continued until the 1970s. The New Left would slowly be broken up over time, and we'll be talking a bit about that, because there's some truly horrendous uses of the institutions of the United States and of supposedly just institutions, that is to say, using the justice system to further political ends. In fact, along with the Black Panthers, the New Left was one of only a few movements that was ever operated on by the COINTELPRO, that is the counterintelligence program operated by the FBI. They would infiltrate sleeper agents. They would try to disband movements by making people distrust each other. And at some points, they would resort to straight-up assassination and bombings. Indeed, at one point, the FBI was responsible for dropping a 500-kilo bomb onto a suburban neighborhood in Ohio, which is absolutely wild, bonkers, batshit bananas to think about, but it has happened. And these are not crazy conspiracy theories. These are straight from the FBI's dossiers, which I think makes it all the worse, is that not only were they willing to commit such heinous acts, but they were willing to write them down, record them, and bring them up for internal review, like any other organization. But today we'll be focusing on Vietnam and the protests that led this small Southeast Asian country to topple multiple U.S. governments. And we'll be talking a bit about the finances of Vietnam, because indeed fighting the Vietnamese would throw the U.S. into a recession unlike it had ever seen before, and Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon's policies in the Middle East, as well as their exorbitant spending in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, would both decouple the U.S. dollar from the gold standard and lead to rapid inflation as well as a shrinking economy. Something that I'm sure we can't see today. This was not the most turbulent time in U.S. history. Indeed, the U.S. did fight a civil war over much more significant issues. But the idea of solidarity and the idea that all social justice issues are wrapped up together and can only be solved through revolutionary means was something new to this time period. Specifically Vietnam, and specifically the policies of Nixon and Kissinger, would lead to something called the New Left. This was one of those turning points in the Cold War. There's very few, because it was a fairly short amount of time. Short, in this case, being over 5 decades. But this was one of the turning points in the Western system when Soviet propaganda, Soviet movements started to fade away and lead into this idea of a new left. This was a left not dominated by career politicians and bureaucrats from Moscow. This was not dominated by people who had attended the internationals. This was dominated by local people organizing locally and funded sometimes, by the Eastern Bloc. The vast majority of the time they weren't, and boy did conservatives love throwing that accusation around that they were funded via Moscow, but this was a fundamental change in how U.S. policy and how U.S. politics around the world played out. Because we would go from Soviet policies and Soviet politicians running in elections to radical fronts starting up in Germany and in France and in Italy, and starting years of terror and bloodshed. In fact, the Red Army faction is intensely linked with the Nixon-Kissinger era, and this is something we often forget. We often know about how much resistance there was to the Vietnam War in the United States, but we often forget how much resistance there was around the world, because this was a conflict that had been raging since 1941. It had been unceasing for any amount of time since then, and for over 3 decades, Vietnam was embroiled in war, and the rest of the world did care. Some of the largest actions against Vietnam were held in West Germany, in France, very ironically, because they had been kicked out of Indochina almost 20 years prior. But many of the largest movements against the Vietnam War were from outside of the US. Partially because they had less to lose and had less restrictive governments, and partially because, they didn't have propaganda throwing things about communists every 5 seconds. Because these were people who could see communists on a regular basis and knew that Vietnamese communists halfway around the world posed literally no threat to their way of life. Now, this is a heavy episode, and we're going to be talking about a lot of things because Nixon was a terrible, terrible person. And boy, did he absolutely love just stirring it up. He loved starting new things, and by new things, I mean the war on drugs, and he loved starting things like radical police suppression and militarizing the police. This was indeed the era from where SWAT came from, that is Special Weapons and Tactics, often used as a hit team against lower income neighborhoods, but that's a separate thing. SWAT was originally designed specifically for crowd control. This is something that it utterly failed at, and the National Guard and military units would have to be brought out time and time again. But it was originally meant for this purpose, and it was originally from all of the clashes and all of the death that resulted from National Guardsmen being wheeled out at every single opportunity during this era. And that's something we often forget, is that these rallies had hundreds of thousands of people. A lot of the time, this was the first time students were organizing their entire lives, and they were incredible at it. There was routine rallies of hundreds of thousands of people across the US, and the police and military response was almost exclusively violent. This would give them a chance later on to refine their tactics into what we see today, but during this time, the police and military really knew no other response other than to shoot or beat whoever was in front of them, which is very unfortunate for everyone involved in the conflict, because it led to not only all of those young men dying in Vietnam, but it led to a bunch of young people and a bunch of people in general being hurt in the States. They were being hurt for exercising their constitutional right to free speech, which is something that, like a lot of authoritarians, Nixon really did not respect. Later on in this episode, and getting towards the end, we'll be talking about the parallels between Richard Nixon and some current US politicians. And we'll be talking about how Watergate kind of foresaw and predicted how radical right-wing politicians would soon try to rule the United States, regardless of the institutions and morals of the land. Now, there is so much music to choose from this episode. All of it is so good. But unfortunately, I do have to make a choice, because we do have to listen to some music. It's early in the morning. No one wants to hear me speak for an entire hour straight. which is completely understandable because it is 9 a.m. on a Monday morning, and I appreciate everyone so much for being here. We are still having our fundraising time, and if you would like to donate, you are absolutely more than welcome to, because we are still in donation season. So if you want to support this or any other shows on CIUT, you can donate at ciut.fm. And we want to thank everyone who's donated so far, because we are incredibly close to our goal of $100,000. The last time I checked, we were sitting at just over $90,000 raised by listeners. And I just want to thank everyone so much for that. We'll be talking more about the specifics of the protests in Vietnam and how they led to a tense situation in the U.S. that would only be resolved through bloodshed. And we'll talk about Nixon's absolute paranoia of being seen as a democratic figure, regardless of whether he actually cared, because boy knows he didn't. He was willing to wiretap the Democratic National Convention. He was willing to use force whenever necessary, and indeed whenever possible, many times. And he was willing to use non-partisan government agencies to enforce his party's position on the masses. But we'll be talking about that and so much more shortly. Until then, just enjoy the music.
You say you want a revolution. Well, you know, we all want to change the world. You tell me that it's evolution. Well, you know, we all want to change the world. But when you talk about destruction, don't you know that you can count me out? Don't you know it's gonna be alright? Alright. Alright. You say you got a real solution. Well, you know, we'd all love to see the plan. You asked me for a contribution. Well, you know, we all doing what we can. But if you want money for people with minds that hate, all I can tell you is, brother, you have to wait. Don't you know it's gonna be alright? Alright. Alright. You say you change the Constitution. Well, you know, we all want to change your head. You tell me it's the institution. Well, you know, you better free your mind instead. But if you go carrying pictures of Chairman Mao, you ain't gonna make it with anyone anyhow. Don't you know it's gonna be alright? Alright. 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 Alright.
That was Revolution by the Beatles. Very famously a part of the New Left, and we would see this intertwining of music, culture, and politics during this time. Although people tend to forget how much music and politics were wrapped up before this, but that's because all of the music was terrible. No, I'm joking, but this was a time of massive social change for the US. From the early 1960s until the early 1970s, the US underwent a change that was so dramatic that it even outpaced the New Deal and World War II in its ability to change American culture. We went from a white-dominated, segregated country, and by we, I mean the US, because I am not American, nor will I ever be, but the US went from a white-dominated, segregated country with extremely limited women's rights to all of these issues being incredibly present, along with regular acts of domestic terrorism by members of the New Left and a resurgence in the white power movement, which I'm sure has caused us no problems in the modern day and certainly did not set the groundwork for any neo-fascists to get into power. Now, I'm obviously being sarcastic there, and it was just a absolute shit show of a time for American policy, and for many, bread and butter Americans like Richard Nixon, if you'd call him that, this was a time of rapid social change for a country that didn't need any, and that absolutely should not change because it had gone the way it did through the hard-working American spirit, and certainly not through the oppression and subjugation of other people. All that wealth from the cotton plantations just magically appeared. And certainly was not from exploited labor or racial dynamics which put people of color at the absolute bottom, no matter how wealthy or successful they were. Now, we can actually see some of the Vietnam protests starting as early as 1945. And we tend to forget that the US and Vietnam were actually allies during the Second World War. Ho Chi Minh, in fact, visited the US and had regular correspondence with the precursor to the CIA, the OSS. The US would fund Ho Chi Minh and his guerrilla fighters before it turned their back on him. Ho Chi Minh would indeed write, in the mid-1940s, a letter to the Roosevelt administration, and this letter would exalt the U.S. Constitution and U.S. republicanism. It would exalt all that he saw as amazing about the U.S. They were allies fighting against an imperial Japanese army, and Ho Chi Minh hoped that they would be allies fighting against the imperial French, because the French did not exist at this point. The French state literally did not exist at all during the mid-1940s because, World War II happened, in case you're unaware of the historical context. And Ho Chi Minh and many other Asian leaders hoped that, while their colonies had been destroyed by the Imperial Japanese, they would finally get nations based on the principles of self-determination that the U.S. founded in World War I. The U.S., however, would go on to hand Vietnam back to the French, who would then proceed to immediately lose their war within 10 years of regaining Vietnam. The U.S. would fund the French in their war and would increasingly send advisors and then helicopter pilots, and they would start supplying munitions, and slowly but surely, the French effort was replaced by an American one. But even in 1945, the American public and many American military knew that this was a morally wrong choice, because the Vietnamese should be allowed to determine their own destiny without foreign imperial powers choosing it for them. And in fact, there was mutinies on 2 ships of French troops. These were American ships. These were the so-called Liberty ships. They were transporting French colonial troops to Vietnam to re-subjugate Vietnam. And the American soldiers on these ships would mutiny and refuse to take the French any further because they believed in self-determination, and they believed that the Vietnamese should not be reconquered by a middling power that had just lost a war to Nazi Germany. But the French Indo-Chinese War would end in 1956 after their disaster at Dien Bien Phu, in which tens of thousands of French Foreign Legionaries would die for apparently no reason and under some of the absolute worst tactical circumstances you can ever imagine. The US would then shift to taking the brunt of the fighting in Vietnam. And you may be saying, well, why is the US fighting someone that only 20 years ago had written the US essentially a fan letter saying how much they love the US? And that's a great question, because you see, if somebody loves your political system and loves the freedoms that it brings, and then you proceed to blow up that man's family, there's a slight chance he may not be as fond of you. And if you proceed to fund the imperialist powers that are actively trying to take his country away, you may think, okay, well, I should find someone who's maybe a little bit less imperialistic, like, I don't know, the Soviet Union or Red China. The US fought in Vietnam under the idea of domino theory, that is, if one country falls, the rest in the region will shortly fall thereafter. This was immediately proven false when no other countries in the region fell to communism immediately after Vietnam. But the US did do a great job at wasting millions of lives and trillions of dollars to spray cancer chemicals and napalm and bombs all over Southeast Asia. Now, Lyndon Johnson was incredibly guilty of raising the Vietnam conflict to the heights that we saw it in 1968. However, the Paris peace talks in 1968 had the exact same terms as what would eventually be decided in 1972. And it is in great historical detail. And there is so many records about how Henry Kissinger, included on the talks as one of America's finest thinkers, which is an interesting take for a man who is wrong on every foreign policy take essentially his entire life. It's quite impressive, really, that someone who can so consistently be wrong in a situation in which at least sometimes you're bound to be right just by the odds of multiple choice. Nope. It's almost like he knew the answers and deliberately did as much harm as he could. But that's a separate thing. He deliberately stalled the peace talks in order so that Nixon, the anti-war advocate, could get elected. Richard Nixon would then commit numerous war crimes, including crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, the regular old war crime, the indiscriminate bombing of civilians, bombing Hanoi when there's a stall in the peace talks. In 1972, so many fun pieces. But the Vietnam War wasn't all bad because it allowed the U.S. military-industrial complex to become incredibly evolved and intertwine with the U.S. internal security to the point where the military and army officials were showing up to defend Dow Chemical complexes in Pennsylvania who were producing napalm to be sprayed at Southeast Asians. This would then have no further consequences for the future, and the U.S. military and military-industrial complex would remain fully separated like in other democratic countries. Oops. But everyone in America, and I shouldn't say everyone because at least half of America supported Vietnam, which I think an incredibly easy solution to this is just whoever supports it can go fight in Vietnam, and whoever doesn't shouldn't have to get drafted. And it's important to remember. It's hard to remember now because the U.S. relies on a volunteer military and crippling student loan debt in order to trick people into joining its armed forces and using technology in order to multiply those forces across the world. But it is important to remember that these people were being sent unwillingly to Vietnam. They were being drafted under the guise that this was a fight almost like World War II in order to go kill Vietnamese people in Vietnam, which there is so much irony there. Good God. And of course, there's an endless amount of movies and songs and literature and everything written about the Vietnamese experience. Or, as the Vietnamese would say, the American experience. Because the Vietnamese would continuously fight from 1941 in the Japanese invasion of French Indochina all the way until the 1980s with the withdrawal of Chinese troops. And they would win each and every one of those conflicts. So, you know what? Good on them. But there was so much backlash to Vietnam, especially with the draft being implemented. And when Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy were assassinated in 1968, it really started to change the nature of the protest. We went from largely peaceful protest to this idea that nothing will ever change unless you make the change yourself. And we started to see more and more violent protests. We started to see more and more radical action. And the thing about radical action is that once you have experience organizing and experience taking direct action, it can be incredibly empowering. It can be addictive to some people. And it's something that you can't really put back in the jar. If you force people to do something they don't want to do, and they're willing to respond with radical action, they will almost certainly continue with radical action for the rest of their lives, regardless of if you reverse that policy. And that's why it's so important to have revolutionary sectors in every society, because it shows governments the consequences of their actions and policy in ways that peaceful protests do not. There's so many famous protests. We can talk about the Kent State Martyrs, the Jackson State Brothers, and all of those people who learned new degrees at their university. Unfortunately, bachelors of bullets. Now that is paraphrasing from the Beach Boys again. Student Revolution time, because it is Student Revolution time in the US. In the 1960s, universities were hotspots for occupation, for demonstrations, and for everything else, because these were the people being affected. It was their friends being sent to Vietnam, and a lot of the time, they would graduate from university and then immediately be sent to Vietnam because they no longer had a college exception. In 1968, at Brown University, Henry Kissinger would give a speech. And over 2/3 of the graduating class would then turn their backs to him and plug their ears, which is incredibly funny. And also, just the right response to if Henry Kissinger starts speaking. On March 14th of 1970, this is, again, after peace could have concluded, had it not been for Henry Kissinger. 2 American merchant marine sailors, that is, people who are employed by the U.S. military but sail civilian vessels in order to supply troops overseas, seized the USS Columbia Eagle and forced them to sail into port in Cambodia rather than Thailand, because this ship was full of napalm bombs to be used by the U.S. Air Force in Vietnam. Obviously, at Kent State in Ohio, the National Guard would murder 4 students during a demonstration. 4 million students would then go on to strike at over 450 universities and colleges in the US. This was really a turning point because students sometimes they get occupied with their studies and they can be treated a lot of the time like kids who don't really know about the real world yet. But if they try to bring your attention to something and then you proceed to murder them, well, it's going to make them angry. This would precipitate the weathermen showing up. That is, the underground weathermen. This is from a very famous song. You don't need to be a weatherman to see which way the winds are blowing. They would start a campaign of small-scale domestic terrorism with very few casualties. This was not like the Ku Klux Klan trying to inflict as many casualties as possible, or right-wing extremists that we've seen now. But they would bomb the U.S. Capitol building in 1971. This is something I think we often forget, is that the U.S. Capitol has indeed been bombed before, and bombed by students at that. The May Day protests would soon follow in 1971, during May, obviously. And the single largest mass arrest in U.S. history would then proceed. Almost 13,000 people would be arrested at one event. 13,000 people arrested for protesting Vietnam. We had maybe a couple hundred people arrested for storming the Capitol building on January 6th, and we've had much, much worse things happen in both the US and in Canada and around the world that have preceded much, much less violence and much, much less arrest. Again in 1971, the Red Army faction, that is the far left sect of German society that would proceed to organize, and especially effectively because they did have a border with East Germany, whereas many students in the US obviously could not get any funding from the Warsaw Pact. But the Red Army faction would detonate car bombs at the European headquarters of the US Army. They would kill 3, but even though it wasn't in Vietnam, it would show that the US military was not safe, no matter where they were around the world. One of the biggest protests that ever happened was at the inauguration of Richard Nixon in 1973. It was called the March Against Racism in the War because, indeed, the war was still going on at this point. It was short to be concluded, but it was still something that lived in the minds of most Americans. Hundreds of thousands of people had died at this point, and millions had become casualties. The Vietnam War really, really set off the modern era of student revolutions, and it really was the height of student power in much of the Western world. Why is that? Well, it's because a lot of our societies have very specifically adapted to their experience in Vietnam in the 1970s and 80s in order to take that power away from young people and students in particular. Because if you're too busy worrying about if you'll ever be able to afford a home in the country you grew up in, how are you going to go out and protest? Yeah, it's not incredible, but there has unfortunately been a concerted effort between governments, law enforcement agencies, and universities to take the power away from students, and indeed to take the power away from faculty and give it to the administrators, and slowly strangle and discombobulate student power. Now, this song isn't about Richard Nixon, but I think it really, really shows the mindset of the Americans in Vietnam, and really, really shows how cynical most people were, because there was almost no one who believed, especially after the peace talks concluded, that the Vietnam War was worth it. Despite all of the government propaganda that told them it was, many people soon came to realize that oh yeah, Vietnam is now communist. And yet it didn't spread not only through the rest of Asia, but through any of Asia after that. We'll be back shortly. You're listening to Student Revolutions in History on CIUT 89.5 FM. And soon, we'll be talking about Watergate. That's right, the terrible, terrible decision made by the US media that would then lead to everything being called Gate after that. You know, Pencilgate, Pizzagate, whatever. Obviously, there was also the whole trying to rig elections thing. But I think the naming thing something Gate is so much more annoying than any kind of rigged election in the US. Now, obviously, I'm joking, but we'll be talking about that and so much more just after the song.
I got a letter from LBJ. It said, "This is your lucky day. It's time to put your khaki trousers on. Though it may seem very clear we've got no job to give you here, so we are sending you to Vietnam." Lyndon Johnson told the nation, "Have no fear of escalation. I am trying everyone to please. Though it isn't really war, we're sending 50,000 more to help save Vietnam from Vietnamese." I jumped off the old troop ship and sank in mud up to my hips. I cussed until the captain called me down. Never mind how hard it's raining, think of all the ground we're gaining. Just don't take one step outside of town. Lyndon Johnson told the nation, "Have no fear of escalation. I am trying everyone to please. Though it isn't really war, we're sending 50,000 more to help save Vietnam from Vietnamese." Every night the local gentry slip out past the sleeping sentry. They go out to join the old VC. In their nightly little dramas, they put on their black pajamas and come lobbing mortar shells at me. But Lyndon Johnson told the nation, "Have no fear of escalation. I am trying everyone to please. Though it isn't really war, we're sending 50,000 more to help save Vietnam from Vietnamese." We'd go around in helicopters like a bunch of big grasshoppers, searching for the Viet Cong in vain. They left a note that they had gone. They had to get down to Saigon, their government positions to maintain. And Lyndon Johnson told the nation, "Have no fear of escalation. I am trying everyone to please. Though it isn't really war, we're sending 50,000 more to help save Vietnam from Vietnamese." Well, here I sit in this rice paddy, wondering about Big Daddy, and I know that Lyndon loves me so. Yet how sadly I remember way back yonder in November when he said I'd never have to go. But Lyndon Johnson told the nation, "Have no fear of escalation. I am trying everyone to please. Though it isn't really war, we're sending 50,000 more to help save Vietnam from Vietnamese."
That was Lyndon Johnson Told the Nation by Tom Paxton. Another just incredible song. And I really do appreciate that this is the era at which protest music, it didn't originate, but oh my God, did it get good. Now we're going to be talking about Watergate. Yay! And we're going to be talking about the abuse of U.S. institutions in order to further political agendas. Something that I'm sure is not relevant at all in any way to today, and also my weekly reminder that Project 2025, the U.S. conservative attempt to turn the U.S. into a weird fascist Christian kleptocracy, is now 1 year and a month away because we are in December of 2023. Yay! We'll be talking about that more And unfortunately, actually no, fortunately, I'm going home for Christmas, but unfortunately I will not be here. But don't you worry, because every episode is recorded, and we will be producing episodes. The team behind Student Revolutions will be making episodes so that there will not be a single week in which there will be no new content. So you can all enjoy that and so much more. Just to give you a brief little smattering of what we'll be talking about next week, we'll be doing a two-parter. Well, we'll be starting a two-parter and leading off of this week into American fascism, its history, its current day implications, because oh my god, does it have a lot of current day implications, and how various groups in the US have abused institutions throughout history in order to further their agenda. And unfortunately, this is something that has become incredibly common, and we'll be talking about that during this last little 15 minutes. But we'll be talking about the abuse of US institutions, but the normalization of that abuse as well. Because it's a very different thing to try to rig an election, even though Richard Nixon was going to win anyway, but then resign out of shame. It's a very different thing than trying to storm the Capitol and not having a single regret or ounce of shame about it. Richard Nixon, for all of his shittiness, and he was indeed a terrible person, like just truly, truly awful. Also, a very fun side note is that he could not figure out how to open child-proof Advil bottles, and even though his government had regulated them through the FDA, when his staff found him one time trying to cure a headache with Advil, they found teeth marks gnawed into the cap of the bottle because he didn't understand how to press down and turn to the left. But that's okay, because I'm sure he was a fantastic president who had no problems, either foreign or domestic. But he was a man, although for all of his terrible qualities, who did at least respect appearances. He didn't just stay in office when he could have. He wanted to look like a democratic leader. He wanted to appear as though he had been democratically elected, and above anything else, he wanted to be respected, like all of the other leaders in US history. So what does this have to do with students and student revolutions? Well, the constant pressure from students. And I mean truly constant, because the largest protests in US history kept outdoing themselves year after year after year after year. And Nixon's 1968 promise to the nation that he would end the Vietnam War, because at this point we didn't know he had deliberately continued the Vietnam War in order to get elected, but his promise he would end the Vietnam War would not hold up until his second term. And indeed, it would immediately be fulfilled within literally 30 days of his second term being inaugurated, which is incredibly funny, but there was so much anger at Richard Nixon because truly the US could have withdrawn from Vietnam at literally any time and it would have had the exact same result. At any point between 1956 and 1973, the US could have just stopped sending people to Vietnam. And indeed, it wasn't a passive choice to keep people there. It was an active choice that cost trillions upon trillions of dollars, which is kind of hard to comprehend. If you were alive back then, you might remember the terrible, terrible economic times of the 70s. They called it stagflation, which is a horrible portmanteau and really just sounds like a bachelor party gone wrong. But one of the most significant causes of that was both Richard Nixon's failure in his Middle Eastern policy and, most importantly, the Vietnam War, which cost literally millions of dollars per soldier that the US sent out. With this pressure, Richard Nixon really, really felt that in order to not be a one-term president, he would have to resort to extreme and maybe not the most democratic measures. Eventually, 69 people would be indicted, and almost all of them would be convicted in the Watergate scandal. In case you're not aware, I'm going to do a very brief overview, but you can research it. It's very well documented. Essentially, Richard Nixon's goons were paid from his account, and the campaign to re-elect Richard Nixon was actually a fake organization laundering money from donations from real Americans into paying for wiretapping supplies and burglary supplies so that Republican security guards could break into the Democratic headquarters at the Watergate Hotel. But the main problem with this was not Watergate itself, but the cover-up of Watergate, because it would be a full 2 years between when Watergate was revealed, when the police were called and arrested the burglars, and from when the tapes would come out. And you might ask yourself, why the hell would Richard Nixon tape himself on incredibly incriminating evidence? That's actually a great question. The most likely theory that I've heard, and I think the most plausible theory, is that he had a voice-activated tape recorder deliberately so that J. Edgar Hoover could not blackmail him, because J. Edgar Hoover had been director of the FBI for over 50 years at that point. He was a crazy person, and he was one of the most powerful people in all of America, despite being unelected, of course. But along with actively trying to get inside the Democratic campaign, Richard Nixon would also start a new policy to help himself get reelected. He would try to diminish the base of people allowed to vote for the Democratic Party, because in America, prisoners do not have the right of voting, which is absolutely insane and kind of horrific. But this was one of the men who was convicted and sent to prison. This is a man who was sent to prison for his role in the Watergate scandal, John Ehrlichman. This is a quote from him about the Nixon campaign's idea to reduce the voting population for the Democratic candidate through the war on drugs. The Nixon campaign in '68 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies: the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. But by getting the public to associate hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the war on drugs? Of course we did. Now, this was not some random aide in the White House. This was Nixon's domestic policy chief. This was one of two men who had formed the so-called Berlin Wall inside the White House and would have the closest access to Nixon, closer even than Henry Kissinger. If there is a damning quote in the world, I really, really cannot think of one more so than that. The Nixon administration would use U.S. institutions, and specifically under the pretext of law and order, to criminalize their enemies. The FBI, the CIA, the IRS, and local law enforcement agencies would routinely raid anyone suspected of harboring drugs, and really, they started the war on drugs right there so that they could continue their war in Vietnam. Which I think is very ironic, because they started a war on drugs in order to finish the war in Vietnam, and then drugs ended up winning their war. Which is kind of amazing. It's like how LBJ started a war on poverty and then lost. Maybe we should stop declaring war on concepts and instead start declaring war on people. No, I'm joking. We should not declare war on anything. And the idea that is so entrenched in America that in order to fight something properly, you have to declare war on it instead of, like, I don't know, a public health emergency is absolutely kind of crazy and horrible, to be honest. Now, Watergate would only come out because certain people within the Nixon administration, and specifically non-appointed officials within the institutions surrounding the cover-up, would leak their news to the press. The deputy director of the FBI would become an anonymous source for the media. If this happened now, he would get Edward Snowdened and sent to Russia or executed because of the Patriot Act and all of the horrible legislation that's been passed since then. And we really, really see the difference between now and then. Because although Nixon did a horrible, horrible thing and was incredibly unapologetic about doing it, the other Republicans in his party sought to kick him out, to cleanse the party. Both the Senate Republican leader and the House Republican leader recommended that Nixon be both removed and tried for his crimes. Now, in an age and day where the Republican Party loves to form an impenetrable wall around their leaders, this is incredibly, incredibly hard to think of. But it's something that I think should be more common. That is, not trying someone based on their party allegiance, but trying someone based on their crime. Now, just before we end this episode off, because unfortunately we do have to go, stay tuned. Democracy Now! Is up after this, and it's fantastic. But I do want some ending notes, because I have too many notes that I didn't get to say about how much I fucking hate Henry Kissinger. I hate him so much. This is just a couple fun facts before we end out today's episode. His undergraduate thesis was over 400 pages long and is the origin of the current limit on length for undergraduate thesis in universities, which is so funny that he just wrote so much that people hated reading it so much that they literally set a limit for every undergraduate following him to not be like Henry Kissinger. More insidiously, however, was something called the National Security Study Memorandum 200, Implications of Worldwide Population Growth for U.S. Security and Overseas Interest. Now, if you're not convinced Henry Kissinger was a bad person, let me convince you in about 30 seconds. This was known as the Kissinger Report and was a national security directive in 1974. The report detailed how the U.S. could use human population control to limit the political power of underdeveloped nations and ensure easy extraction of foreign natural resources, which is just a great way to say how the U.S. could use genocide abroad in order to further their interests and to stop countries that had big populations from being represented on the world stage. This was Student Revolutions in History. Thanks for listening, everyone.
From